to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, this is Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist and a teacher, and I'm your host on Raising Teens. As a parent, I know that raising a teenager can be an incredible, exhilarating, and joyous journey. It can also be confusing and really lonely at times. On this podcast, we are going to be joined by well-known experts where we chat about some of the most common questions that I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work. Our episodes are jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with, supporting, and loving your teen.
Dr. Zac Seidler is a clinical psychologist, the Director of Mental Health Training at Movember, and a Senior Research Fellow with Origin at the University of Melbourne. Zac has devoted several years to the goal of reducing the staggering male suicide rate, treating and researching men's mental health with over 50 peer-reviewed articles published. Zac has worked clinically with men of different ages and presentations, from adolescents in Darwin with early psychosis to older HIV-positive men struggling with adjustment. Zac is a member on the advisory committees for Life in Mind, White Ribbon, Migration Council of Australia, the National Mental Health Commission, and Suicide Prevention Australia. Be advised that this episode does contain discussion around mental health, suicide, and self-harm. If you or someone you know is struggling with any of these issues, call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Or, if it's an emergency, call 000. We will also have more resources in the show notes, and please remember that whatever you're facing, you deserve support.
Hi, Zac, and thank you so much for joining Raising Teens podcast.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So, Zac, you won't know this, but a few years ago, I actually heard you speak on a webinar advertised, I think it was through the Black Dog Institute. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to, in fact, have you now on my own podcast. But in the webinar, I remember you sharing about how you became involved in this area on researching men's mental health. And you also shared some of your own personal story.
So it's a complex one and something, that I continue to reflect on how I got to where I am. But the simple answer is that I lost my dad to suicide 10 years ago or so. It's pretty crazy how time passes. And it was 2013, and dealing with that type of grief and trauma in many ways. I was overseas at the time, and reflecting on the loss of a role model and a father figure in many ways has had very profound ramifications on my life and my family's life, obviously. But, in saying that, I was already on the road to becoming a psychologist. It was gender and the way that young men interacted in the world was always something that intrigued me. And so, if anything, losing my dad just lit a fire in my belly and got me on the road to further pursuing this stuff and seeking answers more fervently, I think, than probably I would have if not to have lost him. And in many ways as well, while there is no positive outcome to such a loss, there are certain silver linings where I get the ability to interact and speak on podcasts like this and get to share my experience and what I went through. And so, hopefully my dad's suffering wasn't in vain, and I get the ability to hopefully just take away some of the pain that others are feeling and let them know that they're not alone and that there are many options to help you get through those dark times.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, Zac, we hear so much about boys and how they're struggling really across a number of areas. Boys are struggling academically, emotionally, psychologically, socially. Can you just talk about some of what you're seeing in your work, Zac? What do you believe the reasons are for some of these findings around our boys' struggles?
So it's a very complex piece because there are all of these different sectors, I guess, all of these different, modes of being that young men are very clearly in comparison to young girls faring pretty poorly. Whether you look at their academics, you look at the way that they socialize, you look at violence, and in the States you can look at gun violence, you can look at all of this stuff, and reliably is going to show you that men are not doing very well. Our health outcomes in this country, we die on average, 4 to 6 years earlier than women do. So while we live in a country where men have a lot of power and a lot of privilege, and there's no doubt about that, it's not actually conferring benefits on our well-being in the long term. And so the reason I think that lots of this is happening, and my research and clinical work is very much embedded in this, is the way that boys are brought up, is the development of masculinities in many ways, is the idea of what a boy and a man can and should be. And I've said this many times before, but I think that our society fails young men by firstly not providing very good role models. Secondly, fatherhood has never been something that we privilege, something that we actively work towards and believe is a huge benefit to any man. And so that means that we have a vacuum in many ways in many households where the father figure is not necessarily as present or as active as they should be. And then really what it comes down to is that the way that, men and boys interact with one another is fundamentally problematic in many ways just because of a belief, a standard that they feel they need to live up to. And so what I always say is that we're very good at telling boys what not to do, but we're not good at telling them what to do. We're not very good at creating a doctrine, a mantra about what it means to be a man in this day and age. No one's suggesting that it's easy. And I don't think that we need to sugarcoat it, but we do need to create a path forward because there's been a lot of negativity, and in some instances it's deserved because there has been plenty of bad behavior on display. But nonetheless, you need to equate that. You need to find a way to have a narrative that is telling boys that they are capable, that they have potential, that there is something to look forward to and to work towards. Because otherwise, what's happening on the ground is that I'm just surrounded by disillusioned, angry, shame-filled victims in many ways that these young boys are seeing themselves as, and it's really not doing very well for us.
So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about teen boys' mental health. Why specifically teen boys, you might ask? Well, because the statistics about boys' and girls' mental health and suicide rate are quite different, I think it's really important that we address how we support boys specifically in this episode. I will be talking about issues specific to girls too, so listen out for those episodes coming up. So you touched on two things there that stood out to me. You were talking about how we haven't celebrated fatherhood, the celebration of your career and what you've achieved outside of the family is what is held up as the most important thing to men and dads. And then also your aspect of we often tell boys what they're doing wrong. So, in schools, we will keep them in at recess or, give them detentions, but then we're not actually giving them other options or saying, well, perhaps that wasn't the appropriate way to deal with your mates or your teacher, but then we're not showing them what is. And so, you're highlighting role models is just so important. I actually addressed the term toxic masculinity in my own book, and I know there's a lot of misunderstandings on what this term means. And it's often misunderstood to mean maleness or being a male in itself is toxic, when actually it's just an attempt to really confront the stereotypes. And some of the things you've already highlighted, that the ways we interact with boys is toxic to them. So I really appreciate some of your own discussions and writings that I've seen in the media on this term toxic masculinity. Just chat to us a bit about how you frame that.
For sure. So first off, toxic masculinity is not a scientific term.
Yes.
It is a media created term. And, it's alarmist in that way because the media needs to get clicks. And so the way that it was created was that it largely took flight in the Me Too movement, and it was taken out of context, I think, in many ways, in that I believe toxic masculinity should be related to certain behaviors. Certain behaviors that are linked with masculine stereotypes can be toxic, can be dangerous, can be harmful to others. But the way that it's now been misconstrued, I think, is that, yes, maleness, manhood, being a man is fundamentally at its core toxic. And what that does is it directly shames and isolates the very men that we want to engage. And so we end up in a very dangerous status quo where we are now, where those young guys who are going through an identity formation are getting hammered from every angle by a media which is suggesting that everything that they do is wrong and is broken and is toxic. If you speak to any of the people writing these books or writing these articles, they will all share a very similar ideal to me. But the problem is that a young guy who is already feeling like a victim is going to read what he wants. He's going to see it in a way that he wants. And so we need to find a way to really focus on flexible masculinity, which is something I talk about a lot, which is the notion that, yes, certain behaviors are toxic in many instances. But if you flip them on their head, stoicism and self-reliance can be really toxic in the wrong circumstances. But, in others, if you're a firefighter, you can't suddenly break down mid-fire. You need to go in, you need to get it done, and then you can come out and you can be vulnerable and you can discuss what happened and you can debrief. And so time, place, and context are essential. And what I hope young men especially are going to take on board is the idea that rigidity is the most dangerous thing that we can have as guys, which is, here is how I work, this is what I do, and this is going to be across the board, no matter who's in front of me, no matter what room I'm in, this is how I react to things, this is how I respond to things. It's very dangerous, it's very harmful. That is not what masculinity was ever created to be. It's supposed to be adaptive. It's supposed to be about self-development and growth. And I think we've lost sight of that.
That illustration you just gave of the firefighter, that's magnificent because it gives such a beautiful picture of the opposite of rigidity that you just pointed out, where you can be stoic and strong in certain situations, but then coming out of that exact situation, you can be vulnerable and express your emotion. So yeah, that's a beautiful picture. Going now a little bit more into the mental health side, there's a lot of current research that still highlights that by around mid-adolescence, our girls are more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with a mood disorder than boys. But Zac, our boys and our men are more likely to die by suicide than women and girls. And there's such an underlying issue for me that even though we're looking at these statistics, our boys then are not speaking up, or they don't feel like they have permission to speak about where they are struggling. What do you see or know of teen boys' mental health?
So the statistics are wrong to start with. I'm on the ground and they're just wrong. And it's not anyone's fault for why they are wrong, but I'll tell you why they are missing the mark. While you look at the likes of depression or anxiety and you see that young girls are experiencing this at much higher rates. And just as a caveat from the outset, my work full stop is not to reduce focus on young girls. They have plenty they are going through. And, the past generations for young women have been an absolute nightmare. So this is not a one or the other. It's an and situation. So, they experience anxiety and depression at much higher rates according to your everyday statistics. But when you start to look at other disorders, externalizing disorders like ADHD and like conduct disorder and all of these boys being boys disorders, you end up with a different picture where you start to see, maybe some of the stuff that we are believing to be different expressions of mental health issues are actually just a cry for help. And so what we know is that if we expand a typical depression measure where we go, all right, hopelessness, worthlessness, fatigue, not eating, all of the typical things, she's on the couch crying and eating ice cream is the stereotype, for instance. Depression looks very, very different in young men. It comes out as anger, irritability, substance misuse, violence. It's where the internal is exploding into the external. It's when the bucket is overflowed, and it's because there is either difficulty actually understanding what is happening for them, or there is a purposeful masking of it. So there are two different ways, and we always go down the route of, young guys are just avoiding this stuff and they're purposefully avoiding it. Whereas in fact, I think that there are many young guys who actually couldn't label what's happening for them, who wouldn't have the language or do not have the support to actually come out and describe what's happening. So it's incumbent on us as society members, as family members, to really open up these conversations and understand that distress just looks different in young guys. And that's why you end up with the suicide rate down the line, because if there's no discussion of all of those other cries for help along the way that are just seen as something else, rather than actual mental health difficulties, then it's no wonder that they end up harming themselves.
I'm so glad you spoke about the fact that often boys don't have the language, because boys perhaps never hear that when I'm exploding in anger or I'm, engaging in risk-taking behaviors that are actually really harmful and could end up in hurting myself really badly. They don't realize that that is also a sign of a mental health struggle. So I'm so grateful for you highlighting that. Because, this is the topic we're all talking about, has there been a difference, or have you noticed a difference pre and post the start of COVID in teen boys' mental health?
I think what I've witnessed is the impact of social isolation has serious ramifications for young boys in ways that it doesn't young girls, I think. And that's because if they've gone 15 years of their life interacting in certain ways, which is often through shoulder-to-shoulder activities, like football, like being at school and doing activities together, if they were suddenly unable to do that, emotional chats on the phone are just not how young men relate to one another. And the suggestion that they should is not necessary either. This idea that we need to fit young boys into a box of how vulnerability and how mental health should look is just not useful.
Yeah.
We need to adapt to the way that they work. And so what I witnessed during COVID was a lot of social isolation and loneliness amongst young boys. The really hard thing is that lots of the very things that we think are harmful for young guys are actually their lifeline. So gaming, for instance. There's a reason that they're addicted to doing it for 6 hours a night. There's a bit of the game itself being addictive, but most of them have headphones in and are chatting to their mates. And it's the closest that they could get to connection and shared experience over the course of the pandemic. So I'm very interested and worried in many ways to see how the past 2 years are going to impact on young guys and teenagers specifically. And, all of these really formational years in understanding who they are and who they want to be and who they love and what's important to them. Hopefully, I'm not going to be overly pessimistic. I don't think it's been lost, but I think there's been a big pause on lots of it. In saying that, on the flip side, I think they are going to be the most resilient generation that we've got coming around. So we just need to offer them the support. We need to bolster their self-esteem. We need to reinforce social connection for them and ensure that they are held accordingly. But there is equal opportunity and equal risk here, I think, in some ways.
Yes. So what are some of the signs then that we're looking for in our teen boys? What would you encourage a parent to notice that their son is struggling with their mental health? Could you give a few tips on what parents ought to look out for?
For sure. The very hard thing here with even in my clinical work in diagnosing young guys, because I get a glimpse. I don't have to go home with them. I don't have to see what necessarily happens day to day. But the most important thing to pay attention to is a change in character. So if your young boy is not irritable and grumpy around his friends, for instance, and he's just irritable and grumpy around you, don't take it personally. That's just the way it is. That's just what growth and trying to identify as an individual and break away from the family unit looks like. If they are angry and potentially violent and aggressive at home, and this is bleeding out into the way that they relate with others as well, a generalizing of an effect in any way across contexts is pretty dangerous. And so if they still have places where they are overtly happy and really clearly having a good time and able to connect there and that they're just not that engaged at home, that's different from at school, they're not engaging. At home, they're not engaging. With friends, they're just completely disconnecting. And so that's when you start to see, all right, over the past couple of months, I've seen him slowly distance himself. He won't tell me anything that's going on. And the initial irritability has really moved into something that's a bit more harmful. The really hard thing is that the majority of these young guys will not engage with a clinician. And so I would recommend 2 things to any parent when it comes to help seeking. The first is that if you are a father or a mother, talking to your children about your own mental health is extremely important, and not in a way that I got over this, because none of us got over it. We're still dealing with it day to day. Let's be clear on that. It's an ongoing journey. There's There's ups and downs, but if you experience depression or anxiety, you experience it. And it will come for you one way or another, and it's a way to start to incorporate it into your life and learn to love it and see it as a strength in some ways as well, because it gives you depth of feeling and the ability to empathize and whatever else it may be. So talking to your children about what you go through not what you went through, but what you go through, and start to normalize this stuff around them, means that they won't think that there's something wrong with them when the chat comes up about their own mental health, because you are starting that discussion and starting it before shit hits the fan, preemptively with your teenage kids who everything may be going swimmingly. It doesn't, nothing gets worse if you have these conversations. If you start to talk about depression or anxiety or suicide, let's be very clear. There is no evidence, there is anti-evidence to show that if you talk about this stuff, it's not going to make them suicidal. There is no such thing. That never happens. It's actually going to improve their ability to discuss it. It's going to improve their comfort to talk about it. So it's really important that parents lead the way here in making these conversations commonplace at the dinner table, etc., and talking about their own help seeking, so that it's not something that's completely alien when it comes to the child.
And I know you would be the same. The one thing I would say to parents, though, is if you are struggling with your mental health, it's important to then have your own psychologist or support or adult, so that you're not
burden your children.
Yeah, so your child isn't your counselor. You're not burdening them, but absolutely still being open with the sharing and encouraging them that I've also sought help as a way of encouraging help seeking in your child. What do parents do when, I know you and I would call it self-medicating behaviors. That is when you know that they are struggling, but they're trying weed and drinking too much and withdrawing, and they're saying that they don't want help. What would you advise a parent in that situation who knows their child desperately needs help, but they won't hear from a parent?
It's very difficult. Yes. And I've been in many situations as a clinician trying to talk to, let alone young boys, talk to adults about this stuff. And a lot of it is a coping mechanism, is them being very afraid of when they stop this stuff, what their brain will start telling them.
You just heard the term self-medicating. Let me start by talking about self-soothing behaviors. So this refers to any kind of behavior that a teenager might use to regulate an emotional state on their own. So things like squeezing a stress ball or listening to music, taking a shower, playing video games, or even healthy exercise. These are behaviors that they might use in times of stress to bring calm or comfort. But when any of these are taken to the extreme, these are called self-medicating behaviors. And these are often more destructive forms of attempts to lower stress or cope with mental health symptoms. Some of the common examples might be overeating, excessive exercise, binge drinking, or taking drugs.
First and foremost is empathy and a discussion around the fact that, you may not understand why this is happening, but you should at least try, because demonizing it on the whole and pretending it's not happening or punishing them endlessly for doing this only makes you an adversary and makes you someone who they are not going to come to in times of need. There obviously have to be boundaries, but you can do it in a way that shows them love and support and doesn't pit you against them. Many times it's about the fact that they are very worried about what life looks like without these things. And at some point, it's very important to separate between risk-taking and adventure-seeking and just doing stuff for the sake of it, as a teenage boy tends to do, and a problem behavior. And if you are not the person to do this and have these conversations, finding somebody who they relate to and who they are willing to listen to, and it's often not going to be a parent. Fundamentally, the child often does not want to overburden the parents and make them worry even more. That's why suicidal thoughts are never discussed, especially between young boys and their mothers, for instance, because I don't want her to worry, blah, blah, blah. It's like, mate, she's going to worry a lot more if you attempt. I assure you that. So, and this is where the role model part comes in. We should be constantly cultivating role models for these young guys in their life, mentors to provide rites of passage around how to go about life. And if you can create those relationships, I always turn to my grandfather, which is very strange because apparently he was extremely strict on my mum. But with us, he was a sounding board. And so, having those relationships. And I think the thing as a parent, which is really difficult, is that parents aren't okay often without being in the know. And with letting go of control every once in a while, especially when it comes to clinical work, because of confidentiality, I ask the boy if he wants me to tell his parents what's going on. And often he says no, and the parent needs to handle that. It's a very important part of individuating. And so I think that stepping back and just trying to offer the support and belief that you trust, if you tell him to go and speak with someone and you find out that you trusted that conversation was hopefully going to be useful. Being nosy and trying to have the last word is not going to end well for you. Trusting him, supporting him, being honest and authentic as your own self, that's all you can do as a parent.
Zac just mentioned the importance of a parent trusting their teen's psychologist and trusting their teen's own ability to use some of the strategies they've been given. In my experience, I also encourage many teens and their parents, once their teen is comfortable within a therapy session, to have parents come in and discuss strategies to use within the home, so that parents can come alongside appropriately and support their child. So really, this becomes about the family supporting the child's mental health journey as opposed to the parents controlling that journey. And interesting, I've found in my own work, very often young people or teenagers who initially say no, they don't want their parents involved. As they begin to work with their psychologist, they actually understand that their parents can be involved in some areas because they're still there all of the week.
Exactly.
And then they trust their psychologist to talk with their parents about little things that might be helpful in the week. But as you said, parents have to wait for their child to be ready for that.
Time and place. Let them grow. Let them learn.
Yes, yeah. So finally, Zac, what is your hope for this area in working with boys and in boys' mental health? What is your greatest hope?
I have a lot of hope in boys themselves. My greatest hope is in the rest of us, in adapting, whether it's from the way that they're talking about distress, the way they're talking about sex, the way they're talking about their education, whatever it is. Just because it doesn't look like you want it to look doesn't mean it's wrong. I often say whenever I'm talking to a young guy, we go through a whole hour session and he was like, "Oh, thank you so much, Zac. I've never spoken about stuff like this before. That was so full on. That was great." And I'm just thinking in my head, I'm like, "Mate, you didn't even touch the sides. Like that was nothing." But for him, it's so powerful. And I'm like, "You haven't said anything that I didn't know when I first saw you." But it takes time. And this is the thing. So that's the first session with him. But then in the sixth session, he's suddenly so much more verbose, so much more able to describe what's happening for him. So give boys the benefit of the doubt and do it early and pay attention. Old mantra of mine, something that I say all the time is that we continue to tell boys to open up, but we're not ready to listen. And so my greatest hope is that we start to listen and we start to not listen in the ways that we want to hear, but the ways that they are speaking.
My favorite take-home message from today's episode is that we often want boys to open up, but we are not ready to listen. I loved how we used the example of a firefighter when talking about flexible masculinity. How in the middle of a fire, they may need stoicism, while vulnerability would be completely appropriate afterwards. If you want to find out more about Zac's work, you can find him at zacseidler.com. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode at raisingteenagers.com.au or via the Raising Teens page at hopepodcast.com.au. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, video edited by Christian Valenzuela, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.